Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 324. In this episode, I'm beginning a new series on the Fall of Númenor, the recently published compilation of Tolkien's Second Age writings. And before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Get those hands up there, everybody. Count it down with me. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., and Eru27. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in January of 2023, JoeBagelMan, David G., Cynthia C., Mike M., John R., Scott W., Jason T., Elena V., Melanie, and Tyler W. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the last year and, in some cases, many years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us keep on evering on and land you some cool perks along the way, like 20% off our merch, including Tolkien Road t-shirts, the coveted Two Trees camper mug, and signed copies of my books. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. YouTube, hit that like button, don't forget to subscribe, and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. So right now, Tolkien fandom is in a weird spot. 2022 was in many ways a watershed year, but it was a mixed bag. It was all about the Rings of Power, right? All of the lead-up excitement for many years leading up to 2022, the first part of the year, kind of the marketing churn, right? But it was a really polarizing reaction. We spent a significant number of episodes on this podcast going through each episode, reacting to different aspects of it. And now here we are waiting for season 2, which isn't supposed to be released until 2024. Also, War of the Rohirrim is supposed to come out that year. So 2024 is looking like it's going to be another pretty big year for Tolkien fandom. I am very excited about the War of the Rohirrim. I'm looking forward to seeing what Rings of Power will do in Season 2. I know that your mileage may vary. Some of you may be very excited. Some of you, I know, just couldn't care less at this point. But that's what I mean by that polarizing reaction, right? But 2024 is going to be maybe an even bigger year in some sense. But what about 2023? Well, this podcast is in a similar spot. Last year, our focus was on a reread of the Silmarillion, as well as a lot of reaction to the Rings of Power, and it was a really busy year for us. At the same time, we've covered a lot of ground over the course of 300 plus episodes on this podcast, and our everyday lives are busier than ever. And as I mentioned a few episodes back, I'm trying to find some time to exercise 2 unwritten Tolkien-themed books that have been haunting me for the last several years. So what's the plan? Well, the plan is to keep it loose. The Tolkienian odds and ends abound, and we'll be continuing to hit works like Smith of Wootton Major, which we started on the last episode, Farmer Giles of Ham, Roverandom, Athorbeth Finrod Andreth, like the list goes on, right? I know some of y'all are like want me to get to the homecoming of Beorhtnoth, or Beorth, I forget it. Anyway, I knew it, I've read it before, but I forgot the name. Anyway, there's tons of works, right? There's tons of works that we still haven't gotten to. And, so I want to get to some of those this year. But, man, I don't want to overload myself, and I don't want to overload all of you, because we got to go back to the old Treebeard mentality, right? Don't be hasty. Don't be hasty. It's worth taking our time with all of these Tolkienian things. And the truth is, it's been several years since we've read Lord of the Rings. And I'm really hungry to have another go at it. But more on that in an upcoming episode. I've got an idea that I'm going to be exploring on that. So more on that in an upcoming episode. There's the Children of Hurin. Right now, it's looking like we'll probably make Children of Hurin something we'll focus on in 2024. Maybe we'll get to it a little later this year. But we're going to keep it loose, and we're going to be jumping around a lot. That's kind of the bottom line, because there are so many things to cover. We've hit like the really big stuff definitely already on this podcast, and now it's just time to just kind of jump around and do some fun stuff over here, do some fun stuff over here, and I'm going to keep you all kind of on your toes from week to week probably. But as for the Fall of Númenor, let me cut to the chase. this year I'd like to intishly make our way through the Fall of Númenor. So let's get started. So what is the Fall of Númenor? This bad boy right here, okay? Well, it came out last year, late last year, and undoubtedly it came out to kind of capitalize, synergize on the hoopla surrounding the Rings of Power Season 1, because the Fall of Númenor is all about the Second Age. It's the story that the Rings of Power is attempting to tell, is attempting to adapt. But the problem is that it's not really a story that Tolkien completely wrote himself. And so this book came about as the idea to basically compile all of these disparate writings which come from all of these so many different sources and organize them into one work that's cohesive and tells the story of Númenor and the Second Age from start to finish. So the key in this is the organization. It's organized around the Second Age timeline from the Lord of the Rings appendices, which is, in other words, the Tale of Years, otherwise known as the Tale of Years. Also, it includes a lot of really great new illustrations by the doyen of Tolkien art. Now, this is not my word. This is a word that came from the dust jacket that I have. What is that word? So Alan Lee, that's who it's referring to. Many of you have probably heard of Alan Lee. I'm sure if you're at all familiar with Tolkien artwork, you've seen his artwork before. His style was very influential on the movies, Peter Jackson's films. But what is a doyen? I had to look this up, okay? The doyen, D-O-Y-E-N, is the most respected or prominent person in a particular field. There's the dictionary. So you come to the Tolkien Road, you're going to learn new words sometimes, all right? Hey, that's what Tolkien was all about, right? He's a philologist, lover of words. All right. So let's look at some of the contents, but let's start with the cover here. Let's start with the cover. Okay, so there you go. There's the Fall of Númenor. Very sort of dark image, I would say, right? Like kind of a haunting, even there's a word on the tip of my tongue that I can't come up with, but it is an image that's kind of frightening, right? You see this wave coming over what appears to be a city. And so if you know anything about the story of the Fall of Númenor, you know what this is depicting. It's literally depicting the destruction of Númenor. So it is an illustration by Alan Lee. And if you have the hard copy like I do here, you can see that it kind of wraps around. It's a really rather large image, and it's also depicted on the inside front cover. So yeah, this is simply put, depicting the Fall of Númenor, and it's a pretty amazing image. Very beautiful. I kind of wonder, if we can actually go in and pick it apart and find different aspects of it. I have to imagine that maybe here in the middle, or I guess down here at the bottom, can you all see my cursor? I don't think you can. Anyway, down at the bottom where it's a little red, where seems to have some glowing light going on, I have to imagine that maybe that's the temple that Sauron constructs towards the end of the Second Age, because there's some burning that goes on there without me going into too much detail right now. So that's this the first image we see from Alan Lee. As I go through these works, I'm going to be talking about the different images that are associated, because he's created a lot of new illustrations for this work, for the Fall of Númenor. So we get to we explore the cover, and the first thing we're going to see when we open up the book is this quote from the Lord of the Rings. This is a quote from the Council of Elrond, the chapter, the Council of Elrond. And it really kind of gets to the heart of what this book is all about. So I'm going to go ahead and read this whole thing. Then all listened while Elrond in his clear voice spoke of Sauron and the Rings of Power and their forging in the Second Age of the world long ago. A part of his tale was known to some there, but the full tale to none, and many eyes were turned to Elrond in fear and wonder as he told of the elven smiths of Eregion and their friendship with Moria, and their eagerness for knowledge, by which Sauron ensnared them. For in that time he was not yet evil to behold, and they received his aid and grew mighty in craft, whereas he learned all their secrets and betrayed them, and forged secretly in the mountain of fire the one ring to be their master. But Celebrimbor was aware of him, and hid the three which he had made, and there was war, and the land was laid waste, and the gate of Moria was shut. Then through all the years that followed he traced the ring, but since that history is elsewhere recounted, even as Elrond himself set it down in his books of lore, it is not here recalled. For it is a long tale, full of deeds great and terrible, and briefly though Elrond spoke, the sun rode up the sky, and the morning was passing ere he ceased. Of Númenor he spoke, its glory and its fall, and the return of the kings of men to Middle-earth out of the deeps of the sea, borne upon the wings of storm. Yeah, so there you go. That's the kind of introduction in Tolkien's own words, I guess you could say, to this volume, to this particular work. What this really gets at is that the story of Númenor, even though it takes place thousands of years before Lord of the Rings, it very much is a companion story to the Lord of the Rings. It gives a ton of background about how we got to where the Lord of the Rings takes place. It is the mental and spiritual background of even emotional background of the participants in the story, whether you have Sauron, Elrond, even those who weren't alive at the time, like Aragorn and Boromir, right? These characters, they know from the lore that's been passed down to them, they know this story of Númenor. So you can kind of think about any story that's like culturally significant to you, right? And to whatever culture it is that you're coming from. It's like one of those stories, right? You could say for Tolkien, in the case of Tolkien, it would be like, on one hand, maybe it's like, the story of Israel, because he is a Catholic. That would have been a story he knew well from going to Mass and hearing the different readings at Mass, and just from his own cultural upbringing as a man of England, right? He would have known like some of the stories of mythology, right, of the various European mythologies, and these would have been important stories to him. So this is something that for the characters at the Council of Elrond, it's a very they know what Númenor was, right? They know these stories, they know different aspects of them, maybe not in every detail, but they probably know more than what's written here, right? You can kind of think about it in those terms. So yeah, this sets the stage for that. And really what we need to understand is, even as Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings, he was developing the story of Númenor kind of at the same time, right? So while he's working over here, he's creating this ancient history over here in order to make The Lord of the Rings seem that much more real. It was just the way he operated, right? If you've listened to other episodes where we talk about the different, like, kind of Tolkien's creative method and his theory of creativity and those sorts of things, you deeply understand why he would operate this way, because it was important to him that there was this thing in the background that made the real times that made the story he was telling seem that much more real. Okay, so this quote helps set the stage for why the Fall of Númenor, what's the point in telling the story, and how it all connects to the Lord of the Rings. All right. So, let's look real quick at the contents of this story. So I'm going to skip through some of the pages here. All right. So we've hit the cover. We skipped over a few of these things, which are a little less interesting. I do want to mention real quick. This was compiled. This is the we've mentioned Alan Lee, the illustrator, but we should definitely mention that it was edited by Brian Sibley. So he's the one who put all of this together. I've done a review of the book when it first came out. It's a shorter, just kind of like book review, right? It's not really like an exploration of it, but it's just kind of a book review, and talked about his background a little bit in that. So I encourage you to go find that video, go find that audio if you're listening to this, and check it out. Okay, so as far as the contents themselves, the thing to understand is that this is organized around the Tale of Years, and it's organized chronologically. So what we've done here is we've pulled a bunch of writings from various sources, and that have already been published. So this is all, as far as Tolkien's writing goes, this is all previously published writing. But we've pulled it all together and organized it in such a way that it follows along a chronological sort of development. And this is a 3,000 year history, right? Númenor, it's actually closer to 3,500 years. That is a vast period of time. And so Númenor, this story is told and pulls all those things together so that they mention them in the appropriate year. And so it's easier that way to really understand the flow of the story of Númenor. Instead of having to read these different sources that don't really that are kind of isolated and out of context, we actually get the full context because of the Tale of Years and the organization here. So, for example, we have the foundation of the Grey Havens and of Lindan, and I believe that's from Akalabaith. We have the Edain reaching Númenor, again, probably from Akalabaith as well. And then we have some writings that actually come from the Nature of Middle-earth, which is a work that was published in late 2021, which was edited by Carl Hostetter. So that's kind of the main part of the contents of the Fall of Númenor. And it's worth noting, too, that there are a couple of interesting things at the end. First, in the appendices. First of all, we have a brief chronicle of the Third Age of Middle-earth. We'll get to that when we get to it. But that gives a little bit of how the story of Númenor connects to the Lord of the Rings through the second period of 3,000 years that separates the end of Númenor, the end of the Second Age, from the start of the Lord of the Rings. And so it kind of connects the dots and gets us to the Lord of the Rings. And then Appendix B is the Númenorean chapters from the Lost Road. Now, the Lost Road is something you'll find in Volume 5 of the History of Middle-earth. This is a very obscure writing. The Lost Road, though, is the original version of the Númenorean legend. Briefly, the story of the Lost Road is that Tolkien and his good friend C.S. Lewis sort of had a gentleman's agreement in the late 30s that they were going to each write a work of speculative fiction. Lewis's job was to write the space travel story, and Tolkien's job was to write the time travel story. Lewis was much more successful, at least at the time, and he wrote the space travel story, which ended up becoming Out of the Silent Planet, ended up becoming the space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. Tolkien attempted to write the time travel story, and that was The Lost Road. Now, this was not sort of what we think of in terms of many time travel stories where you have a machine necessarily, my generation always thinks of Back to the Future when you think of time travel stories. Maybe you think of like Terminator or something like that. But this was more like almost like kind of a psychological time travel story, or kind of like you just kind of find yourself. It was a really interesting approach, and we'll go into it more when we cover this much later on in the appendices. But suffice it to say, it was where the original kind of version of the Númenorean story came from, the Númenorean legend came from. So definitely interesting stuff. One thing we don't find in the appendices, but maybe we'll hit this when we do kind of get to the end of doing it, which could take us a really long time, because I said my mantra here is don't be hasty. We're going to take a really long walk through this, but there is something called the Notion Club Papers, which was kind of a second attempt to tell the story of the Lost Road, but was also never published, and that's not found here. So maybe we'll come back to that, but the important thing to know is that the Lost Road contains kind of the early version of the story of Númenor. Okay, now, last thing I want to hit in this episode about the Fall of Númenor is this early, kind of the first chapter. It's not really a chapter, but the introduction, the pre-introduction, if you will, maybe the prologue about this book. I believe this is Sibley writing. Brian Sibley writing, and he's talking about kind of his intent for the book and what are the sources for these things. So a word on his intent. He says, the intention is not to supplant these works, as each already stands as the definitive presentation of J.R.R. Tolkien's writings, with peerless, insightful commentary and analysis by Christopher Tolkien, but rather to provide extracts from the above, with as few editorial interventions as possible, that illustrate in the author's own words the rich and tumultuous events of the Second Age, as summarized by J.R.R. Tolkien in his The Tale of Years. Okay, so he's juxtaposing with Christopher Tolkien's approach here, and I know Sibley would be the first to just laud Christopher Tolkien and hold him up. But he is juxtaposing here, and he's saying that Christopher Tolkien's approach with Unfinished Tales and then the 12-volume history of Middle Earth was to basically give these different things that he had found of his father's writings, early versions, things that had been left out, interesting sorts of miscellaneous writings, and it was to like give a lot of commentary, his own commentary on like kind of the background of these things. It's an approach that makes those works particularly challenging at times. Unfinished Tales, somewhat challenging. There's parts of the history of Middle Earth where it's extremely challenging to figure out who's actually writing. Is it Christopher or is it J.R.R. Tolkien? And that can be a little bit frustrating at times, especially if you're not an academic reader, because you have to spend a lot of time understanding, oh, this is Christopher talking over here, and this is what he's referring to, and this is when J.R.R. Tolkien jumps in and has things to say. And so I really appreciate this approach by Sibley, because you've kind of, for everyday readers, like I consider myself, and probably most of you all consider yourselves, it's a little bit more accessible this way, because you don't have this kind of constant interjection of different editorial comments into writings that are already challenging enough as it is. So Sibley's intent here is to give us these incredible writings, which are found in all these disparate places, and oftentimes with a lot of editorial contextualizing, and it's to give it to us in a well-ordered, easy to understand the flow of it way. I think it's hugely valuable to do that. So that was Sibley's approach here. As far as kind of the sources for all these things, so we mentioned the timeline. The main source for the timeline is the Tale of Years, which is Appendix B of the Lord of the Rings. The Tale of Years is really fascinating. It's super helpful. Actually, it's really fascinating too when it comes to some of the stuff it says about the Third Age. Also, he does pull a little bit, he says, from Appendix A, the Annals of the Kings and Rulers, as well as some of the material in Unfinished Tales, which contains a chronological listing of the kings of Númenor, the kings, and actually a few queens of Númenor. So the sources for kind of the longer portions of the content, not just the years when things happen, but actually the things that kind of tell the story of that particular period. Those sources vary quite heavily. The key one, obviously, is Akalabaith. Akalabaith is the story of the downfall of Númenor. It's found in the Silmarillion. You also have the story of Aldarion and Eärendil, which is found in Unfinished Tales. It's actually the longest, I guess you would say, kind of in the story, like kind of, if you will, like the story of the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings, right? These are stories that tell kind of up close and personal stories of people living in those times in Middle Earth, right? Aldarion and Eärendil is the only story we have of that nature, right? This kind of up close and personal story that takes place in the Second Age about Númenor. So Aldarion and Eärendil is found there. It'll be interesting when we get to that one. We have the genealogical table that's also found in Unfinished Tales. There is the material found in the History of Akalabaith, which is in the Peoples of Middle Earth, Volume 12 of the History of Middle Earth. The Early History of the Legend and the Fall of Númenor, which are both in the Lost Road and other writings. And the Drowning of Anadune, which is in Sauron Defeated, which is Volume 9, I believe, of the Lord of the Rings. Or I'm sorry, of the History of Middle Earth. There's also, as I mentioned before, there's significant passages from the Nature of Middle Earth, and that's really great because that is a wonderful work, but there's a good portion. There's a lot of that covers so many different things about Middle Earth, and it's nice that the portions that apply to Númenor are actually given to us here, so we can kind of appreciate them within the context of the rest of the story. We also have so various writings, so the Land and Beasts of Númenor, the Lives of the Númenorians, the Aging of Númenorians, those all come from the Nature of Middle Earth. So what you see here, it again, like, it's really kind of cool. Like we're getting a clear, put together picture of the mind of Tolkien when it comes to all these different aspects of the story of the Second Age and the story of the Fall of Númenor, right? we're getting all of these things put together so that it really looks like if it's the book that Tolkien never wrote about Númenor. Now, if he had written it, it probably would have been quite different. It probably would have been something like, it's interesting to kind of speculate like what would that story have looked like, right? Unfortunately, we'll never know, but I could imagine him telling like just volumes and volumes, like it could have been 3 whole Lord of the Rings stories. I feel like about the story of Númenor itself. And I talk some about that in my reaction videos to Rings of Power, like how I would have done it and that kind of thing. Anyway, and the result is of pulling all these different sources together like this is we get one really good compilation of that kind of gives us Tolkien's mind, at least what he left us about this story, about the whole history of Númenor. Finally, there is a little bit that comes from Lord of the Rings. I should also mention we have the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which is in the Silmarillion, and the history of Galadriel and Celeborn in Unfinished Tales, and then Galadriel and Celeborn in the Nature of Middle Earth. And there are a few things from the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings itself that apply to this story of the Second Age. So that's in here as well. Finally, he says a little bit about kind of his editorial approach. So we mentioned before, like he's trying to not do a lot of editorializing, but there is some editorializing. You have to in order to really contextualize and make these things easier to understand. So he has provided some of that editorializing and kind of clearly said this is when it's going to be happening. So the editorial interventions are in a smaller font size and indented. Explanatory emendations by the editor to introduce passages or within the body of an extract are shown in square brackets. So that's that. Well, as I said, we're taking a long, slow walk through this, and so that's going to wrap it up for this episode, right? When we come back to the Fall of Númenor, we're going to discuss this next portion, which will be the introduction, the Saga of a Dark Age. We might make it to the next portion as well, which kind of gives the history of the First Age leading up to that. But we're going to hit this introduction next time we do the Fall of Númenor. So I'm excited about this, you guys. I think we're going to have a lot of fun going through this, taking our time, really understanding all these different aspects of the Fall of Númenor. I know that many people, kind of hardcore, longtime Tolkien fans, were maybe a little bit skeptical when they saw this coming out because it's not like a lot of new publications. But I think at the end of the day, it's really cool to see this happening and it's a really valuable work because it does pull together all these different sources into one cohesive book about Númenor and the Second Age. I think that is an extremely valuable thing, and I'm excited to dive into this with you guys. All right. Well, hey, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. Please leave us that 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoy the Tolkien Road. If you've been listening to multiple episodes, hey, it's time to head on over and make that happen. When you do that, it puts the wind in our sails and helps us to keep on evering on. All right. And hey, don't forget correspondence. I promise we're going to be doing more correspondence. It's just been a busy beginning to the new year, kind of figuring out what we're going to be doing this year, the game plan, keeping it loose. But I want to do the correspondence, and it's going to be fun to hear from you guys as far as the Fall of Númenor goes, and I'm looking forward, hopefully I'm going to be able to hit some correspondence at the end of each one of these episodes as well, kind of save time at the end. All right, so YouTube, TolkienRoad.com, email, TolkienRoadPodcast@gmail.com, Twitter @TolkienRoad. Wherever you can find us, we'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. Okay, well, that's all for this episode, you guys. Thanks to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Eru27, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Mike M., Robert H., Paul D., Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Jacob S., Richard K., Matt R., Matthew W., Garret P., Chris K., John W., Eugene D., Chris B., Daniel S., Seb M., Shana Supreme, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T., Redhawk, Shannon S., Brian O., Zeke F., James L., Chris L., Chuck F., Asya V., Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C., David of Pints with Jack, Eric B., and Johanna T. All right. Thank you all so much for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.